Okay, great. So let's begin. This will be a really informal discussion about the world of podcast. And you're going to be traveling into that world through kind of my lens. And now, the way I was going to do it, I thought about doing it through a PowerPoint, but that's not what I'm going to do. I'm just going to share my screen and treat it as if you were on your own on your laptop and how you'd go about navigating the web to everything interesting in the podcast world. So I'm going to treat it as if you're a brand new novice to podcasts. So what podcasts are is essentially radio on demand. Now, I don't mean that in terms of satellite radio. What I mean is in the past, you've always had content slash broadcasting and it was always live on your radio. But now with technology, they can archive it, encapsulate it, and they'll put that archived content on some type of platform where you as the consumer can come back, click on it, listen to it anytime you want. And then where that spins off that, so we're going to use a lot of hypotheticals. So take a popular personality, Howard Stern, one of the biggest radio shows in history, right? His he's still a radio show, but the way you're going to consume it when they say podcast is the fact that now he can go out and create his own website. You really don't need people like production agencies like ABC anymore. It really cuts out the middleman. So Howard Stern can create his own website, and through that technology, he can encapsulate or really make a list of all of his previous showings, right? And so it really gives power to the people that generate the content. And so when you hear podcasts, don't really think of it as this new novel technology out there that young people are consuming new information. It's really just another way to take the same shows and make them on demand for you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Janet, can you unmute yourself? Can you see my screen?
I cannot. If you go down to the green share button,
I've got it now. Here we go. Okay, are we there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're going to start off. Chartable is a really nice website to really begin the basics. So podcasts are done like anything else in the content game. Everything is put on a provider. Think of it just like your news agencies or your television programs, ABC, NBC. You got to think of those stations as platforms. Now, where you're going to find all your podcasts on, there's three primary ones. When you get your smartphone, in particular your Apple iPhone, it's going to come preset with this app here, Apple Podcast. And all it is you click on it and you can search and it'll bring up all kinds of shows. The next one is the one that I use, and I'll show you my account for Spotify, and I'll go into more depth on each of these as we go along. But and then the third one is Stitcher. Stitcher really, their entire game is podcasts. So these are the three main ones. Now, as you go more into your niche, more of your regional personalities. So say someone like, so we're in New England, Massachusetts, you want a Boston personality, but you want sports, so you're going to go Bob Ryan. You go into Bob Ryan, and his podcast may be done through his radio show on more of a smaller type of provider than say Stitcher, Spotify, or Apple. And what Chartable is relatively new. And what they've done is you can go in here and they have it broken down into country. They'll give you the charts, so the performance charts. Think of it like radio's top 40 or the number one selling music album. They are now charting podcasts for the most popular. And they kind of break it down. You have, so this is done for Apple Podcasts and then Spotify, because again, you have different consumers for each company here. And so we're going to come down here and look at these charts. Chartable has their own. We're going to focus on Apple and Spotify. And so based on these charts, you can really see what are the most popular podcasts. And I'm doing it this way instead of just giving you the best top 10 podcasts to go out there and see. I want to teach you how to go out there and find that content. And so quickly looking, when you compare Apple versus Spotify, we quickly see the Daily. The Daily is a podcast, and we'll click on it. Is a podcast through New York Times, and it gives you a little bio. Most of your podcasts are going to give you a bio. And the Daily essentially is exactly what its title says. It's a daily news program by Michael here that just hits you with the news for that day. And Chartable is going to break down, and don't let Chartable freak you out. This is just next level kind of analytics on the popularity of the podcast itself. What you can do is, if you want to listen through the podcast through Chartable, you come down here to recent episodes and just go see all. And then this will give you, these are all the episodes, and they're dated down here at the bottom. In this way, you can kind of stay. So if you're an avid, the daily listener, you can kind of stay caught up on what it is that you want to be listening to. And so, and then you have your player here. And more often than not, podcasts are free. There are some, you'll run into a paywall every now and then, but more often than not, they are free. There is a Google podcast. I've never used Google Podcast, primarily because I have a Spotify, I pay for a Spotify account. So I usually stay away from Google Podcasts, but it is another route. And so if you're someone who's, I want to listen to a really trendy podcast, let's say I'm of an older generation and my grandkids are coming over on Christmas and they keep talking about this podcast, I want to get in on what they're listening to. This is a quick way to come and just expand your horizon. Quickly, we see some polarizing podcasts. Joe Rogan.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
You said you paid for charitable. How did you do that, or how do you get connected with whichever one you want? Are most of them free?
So I don't pay for Chartable. The one that I do pay for, so this is free. You can just type in Chartable into Google and it'll take you right to here.
Okay.
So I mean, let's just do it. So Chartable. And here we are. Happens real quick. And it'll just take you to here.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can just search podcast, do your thing from there. I'll come back to this, but just to show you what I was talking about, I pay for Spotify. And here's my Spotify account. But before we get into this, we'll come back to Spotify, but just real quick, Spotify is more than just podcast. It's also music and live radio, but we'll come back to Spotify. Looking at these charts again, so just to highlight a podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience is one of the top podcast radio shows in the country. He is a bit polarizing. How to describe Joe Rogan? The kids would call him very bro-y. He's very unabashed, masculine, hunter, meat eater, really unafraid to push buttons, whether it be left or right. But he gets a lot of play. He gets a lot of listeners. And one of his biggest ones to really hit the news cycle was when Bernie Sanders came on his show. And so if you wanted to start off with a Joe Rogan show, go to somewhere like YouTube or go into the Joe Rogan Experience. So again, we're just doing this for practice. Again, these are just analytics. Don't let these freak you out. They're just showing how this particular podcast is moving up and down the popularity charts. Right. And so you would just come down here to recent episodes, see all, and now Joe's got, he's been around for years. He's got tons, number 1400, right? And so you see these here are all the recent, they're dated at the bottom. But if we...
Daniel, can you search for Joe Rogan, Joe Biden podcast?
So let's do that. That's a good example, good question. So let's just see how powerful this is. Now, before we do that, I will say so when you start searching like this, so a very specific search within a specific podcast, it can get proprietary really quick. So for example, if I were to do that on Spotify, he's not licensed through Spotify. So I wouldn't be able to find it here. And so again, you're just going to have to go through and kind of play with it. And so Joe Rogan, let's just always keep it broad. Rogan, Joe Biden. See what we get. So we're not getting anything there. Let's see if we can, I'm not sure how, I've never used Chartable to actually search a podcast, and I don't think it's powerful enough to do that. You'll probably have to go through Apple, which I don't have on my PC. And so I'll show you how we do it. You just go to Google. And so you go Joe Rogan, Joe Biden. Go ahead and hit that podcast for a key term. So instantly, YouTube is always going to pull up stuff. And so The Guardian, now I'm not sure if Joe Biden's ever been on the Joe Rogan show. I haven't heard that. But let's say the Bernie Sanders one, I know for sure. It caught a lot of news. And so you'll instantly get the YouTube here. And then you have news outlets, Guardians, and things like that. And so you're going to have to really filter it off that and go podcast. Joe's very proprietary because he's so big. And so you kind of got to get through that. And so quickly we get to one of our three, Stitcher. And so it looks like Joe is licensed through Stitcher. And so here it is. Bernie Sanders, number 1330, Joe Rogan, play. That's how, if you're a novice and you don't have an account with Stitcher or Spotify or have messed with your Apple podcast account, that's how you just go to Google, click it in, and these three, Stitcher, Spotify, and Apple, have bottlenecked the industry so much that basic Google search is going to take you there. And now Stitcher, the reason why Joe Rogan is probably showing up in Stitcher, because Stitcher specializes in podcasts specifically. So what I mean by that is Stitcher in contrast with Spotify. Spotify is going to do music and albums, all the albums you can want. Whereas Stitcher is going to be more of your focused on all your podcast needs and wants, that type of content versus music content as well. And so when we go back to Chartable, so I wouldn't use, again, Chartable, I'm using Chartable as more of a really easy way to get an overview of the podcast landscape. I wouldn't use Chartable to go out there and listen to your podcast. I would use Chartable just for its namesake, to look at the charts. That's all I would use Chartable for. So that's Joe Rogan. Another popular one, if you find yourself liking to listen to politics and you want to listen to someone who has conservative politics, Ben Shapiro is really popular. And it's the same thing. You just kind of go into it. Chartable gives you a nice little bio. You can come down if you want to listen to the podcast, same as we said before, recent episodes. Yeah, there's really not much to it beyond that. And so we kind of have Joe Rogan, who's just I'd say miscellaneous personality, covers a lot of different topics. Joe can get pretty, so one of the popular sayings, one of the memes with the younger generations are, I don't need to go to college, I listen to the Joe Rogan Experience. He covers a lot of topics, he'll get anything from a neuroscientist onto his show to a politician like Bernie Sanders to where his background really lies and where, let's say, people on the left side of the media and things like that have a hard time with Joe Rogan. His background is mixed martial arts. That's where he comes from. I mean, he's done some TV shows, but his background is he's always been a color analyst for MMA. And so that's kind of where his fame came from. And I say all that to say when he gets his fellow fighter friends onto his show, you're probably not going to like the Joe Rogan Experience that much unless you're really into mixed martial arts, because they can get pretty bro-y real quick. NPR. So NPR is one that I'm not that big on NPR podcast. NPR for the longest time was the radio program that you would go to get your news, to get your think tank kind of content on what's going on in the world, bios with authors and next level discussions that way through live radio. NPR has done a good job on catching up with on-demand radio and podcast and coming up with content for that. I think their content's still lacking, whereas someone like the New York Times has done a really good job with the Daily. The Daily is really popular. I know Janet likes the Daily. She listens to the Daily. NPR, it's kind of BBC-ish. When I lived in Rwanda, I listened to BBC every day. I'm a little bit more of VOA, Voice of America, if I'm going to go to that type of programming. This more popular stuff like Dateline, NBC, ABC types programming, I'm really not into. Like Rachel Maddow, if me personally, if I wanted to listen to that, I would just watch TV. That's not really what I go to podcasts for. But the good thing about podcast is, you work 40 hours a week. You come home, you didn't have time to see that day's live TV broadcasting. You're cooking dinner. That's when I listen to podcasts, is it's background noise and things of that nature. So you could come into Rachel's show. Again, if you were to use Chartable, you would come down here, recent episodes, and really just kind of, and the beautiful thing about it is it's, I don't like the topic that day, this day, that day, coming down to the previous week. And then you can really just kind of pick and choose what you do and don't want to listen to.
And can these be downloaded to your iPhone so you can go for a walk and listen?
Exactly. So let's say, good question. So iPhone specific, it's going to be this app. And I can't really click it. I would click into this app for you, but I'm on my PC. And again, it's Apple and it's proprietary. I can't really get into it. But it's the same thing. If you have your iPhone, you just click on it. You go to your search box, type in the show you want, the personality, and you would download it and go. Like, say you don't have Wi-Fi, you want to leave, go for your walk, and you don't have Wi-Fi, but you want to download it and listen to it. Exactly. It's what I do with Spotify. Is I'll go and download. I have an app, Spotify app on my iPhone, and I can go and listen to the shows that way. That's how I use my music. But again, we'll get to that. But good question. And so just kind of, we're going to move along from Chartable here in a minute, but I just want to give you some overviews on just some of my thoughts on some of the top podcasts. Crime Junkies, big if you're into true crime stories. A lot of people, it gets, and there's other charts out there, so top podcast charts, if you wanted to come here and look. Again, you see different chart, they're getting the same results. The Daily and Joe Rogan are really, really popular. NPR hits up top, and see Crime Junkie hits again. And then another chart. I've never listened to Unlocking, but apparently it's getting a lot of play. A lot of people listen to it. Again, Joe, 3 different charts, top 3 in all charts. The Daily again. Up first, NPR must be doing good with that one. So if you want to check that out. Crime Junkie again. Sugar Calling, I'm not familiar with that.
These are all Apple.
So what this is, you'll learn, and I'll show you down the road, I'll kind of show you the next level marketing on this and how big podcasts are getting. What this is Apple is paying these third-party vendors to get their app up here up front for you to click on, as opposed to Spotify or Stitcher. Just because this button, this Apple button is here, doesn't mean it's specific. The NPR Coronavirus Daily is specific to Apple. You should be able to access it through Stitcher and Spotify as well. Primarily Stitcher, I would say Stitcher. But Spotify can be, it's all through contracts and licensures, and because Spotify is so broad, their podcast can be a little bit more limited. But that's how Stitcher competes with Spotify, is that they have all the podcasts. And so that's why you would pay for Stitcher to have all the podcasts. This is one of my favorite ones, Pod Save America. That is, gosh, I'm forgetting his name right now. Jon Favreau, I believe is, yeah, Jon Favreau. Jon Favreau's claim to fame is that he was the speechwriter for Obama. And so I don't really want to, I'll come back to Pod Save America. I have a long tail for Pod Save America and its birth out of a previous podcast. But Pod Save America is another popular one if you're into politics and time of day thought. This one, actually, I was looking at this one this morning, is relatively new, Planet Money. And I really like economy news. And so NPR has kind of put this one out, and it's really relevant, and I think it could do some good stuff. I might end up diving into Planet Money if you're into that. So we're going to go on from Chartable. You get the idea. It's just, you kind of get an overlay of how podcasts are rated, who's trending, who's not, and really how to go in and find them. And so you can go out, again, I was showing you, top podcast charts is another one to come and see. Podcast Insights, another proprietary chart that's going to give you what's popular right now. I've spoken about Apple Podcast is a quick, easy app that usually comes on your iPhone to search and download podcast. What I want to go into, because people have talked about it, is Spotify. So I pay for Spotify. What Spotify is going to look like. Sorry, I have all this Zoom stuff in my way. I can't see. So if you were to go to Spotify.com, it's going to take you to this website. Now, what this website is just a company overview, right? You're not going to be able to access music and podcasts from this website. What they want you to do is sign up for their premium. Why? Because Spotify is an app, just like the iPhones is an app. So you would pay for it. It's about $10 a month, and you come in here, and this is your Spotify world. And now what Spotify is it's anything and everything in terms of music, radio, and podcast. I really use it for my music. My car, so for example, my car does not have a CD player or a cassette player anymore. It's all digital. What Spotify allows me to do is use their licensure and their cloud to access any album I could think of. So you just keep going for days. Now now it's going to generate, has these algorithms based off your behavior, and it's really accurate in terms of predicting what you want to listen to. And so I was listening to solo piano writing the other day, and so it's going to generate all this piano affiliated content. And then we go into podcast playlist. Today's top podcast, Laugh Out Loud. And it's really good about coming up with list that the algorithm thinks that you're going to want to hear. And so that's just an example of that. I really enjoy Spotify. I haven't bought or downloaded. I haven't touched iTunes in years since I got Spotify, to tell you the truth. I try not to give Apple too much power, but that's neither here nor there. Going back to Stitcher, the same thing. You go to the Stitcher website, it's just like Spotify. This is just their company overlay. They want you to get and pay for the app. They have a premium as well. I'm sure they have a really limited experience through a free app if you wanted to go that route. And if you were to go on there, it will give you all the marketing and learn more that you could want to learn about Stitcher. But Stitcher, again, is really, as opposed to Spotify, podcast specific in terms of what kind of content they provide. Now, I want to go into the world of where, so we were talking about Jon Favreau earlier in Pod Save America and what podcasts have really done. So this is The Ringer. And so The Ringer is really trendy among younger generations, and it was founded and created by, does anybody know who Bill Simmons is? Anybody?
No.
Okay, so Bill Simmons is a bit of a local boy. He is from New England, from Massachusetts specifically. I'm pretty sure the Boston area. I know he went to Holy Cross. Anyways, Bill Simmons used to work for ESPN. And while at ESPN, he wrote a book. And that book was called The Book of Basketball. And it was popular as a bestseller, so on and so forth. But then Bill, through ESPN, created a, how you want to call it, secondary platform called Grantland. And Grantland did so well, the conspiracies are that it scared ESPN, and ESPN killed it. And that's where 538, if you're familiar with ESPN and Chris Herring, 538, that's kind of where 538 came from, was the subsidy of Grantland. And so Bill, of course, got mad and went off and created The Ringer. And what The Ringer is, it's sports meets pop culture. But why I'm highlighting it is it's a media outlet that survives on what we would call a podcast network. So Bill, we call him the Podfather. He's so good. He has a really good voice for radio, but he moved to LA and got to where his guest list just kept turning out these high interest personalities to come onto his radio show. And as budgets for people like ESPN or Fox News Sports and things of that nature got tighter and tighter, and they kept having to shed talent, Bill went out and just grabbed that talent. And so this is a media outlet that the whole idea behind the business model is a podcast network. Each one of these titles represents a different podcast just through The Ringer. And so Bill Simmons, again, we call him the Podfather, and this is Bill. And now you see it's sports heavy. But what The Ringer does is they also do pop culture, things like movies. If you're into TV shows, so a popular one, Game of Thrones, nobody does coverage of pop culture better than The Ringer. So again, for example, Game of Thrones, they do a post-show coverage every week when the show was playing, breaking down the show with Bill and his talent. And there's nobody in media doing it better than The Ringer. So if you're someone who really wants to get acclimated to the trendy things that young people are listening to these days, The Ringer is a really good place to start. Bill does a popular show called Rewatchables, and what they do is he'll get people on like Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, again, because they're Boston and Bill's a big Boston guy, and they'll review shows like The Heat, trendy show back in the 80s, and they'll go through and talk about it. He'll do Oscars coverage and all those things. But if you really want to get into that, he's good friends with Jimmy Kimmel and usually has them around. He has a believe his name is Cousin Sal, and Cousin Sal works for Jimmy Kimmel, but Cousin Sal also has a podcast with Bill Simmons. And so the deeper you dive into the podcast world, you start seeing the tentacles of how different media personalities are connected. Long-winded way to say that, going back to John Favreau, who does Pod Save America, used to be Obama's speechwriter, used to work for Bill Simmons. So after the Obama administration, Favreau came to the Ringer and did a podcast called Keeping It 1600. And this was smack dab 2016 during the primaries leading up to the general election. And Keeping It 1600, again, Favreau's from the Obama administration, so he was blue, a liberal Democrat. And they were, the narratives and really talking about the Hillary campaign and in favor and projection models and all these things. But as we know, 2016 hit and all those models were wrong. And so it really hit Favreau's show and Keeping It 1600 in a very strange way that Favreau, you would think it would have buried it because their projections were so wrong. But in actuality, it made it so popular that Favreau then spun off and went and created Pod Save America, if it's up top here. But that's where that comes from. So really popular political podcast, a really popular personality, direct connection to another entity you wouldn't even think about. They all know each other, they all work together, they all have been around each other at some point or another. So that's the Ringer. That's sports, pop culture, you kind of do that thing. I did want to plug Vice. And so Vice goes we're going to go a little bit beyond podcast just for about 5 minutes here. I really would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to plug Vice. So in the world of content, you usually have the big players like New York Times, Fox News, CNN. Vice, I think of Vice as a third-party option. And where Vice got its claim to fame is Viceland. And what they were known for, the creator, Sean, if I can find Sean anywhere, what they were known for in the beginning is they would go into places like North Korea that no one could either get access to or would be willing to go, and they would sneak cameras in and essentially create this amazing footage. And they would do that over and over again to the point that they've created their own media outlet. Vice was on HBO, but looking at it, it's gotten so big. Shane Smith, that's the creator there. Shane's really, really talented. That it got so big that now it's its own media personality. If you're someone who really likes the news and you want that on, like a podcast on demand news, Vice is a really good place to go. And again, what they're known for is their visuals and how they can go into places and cover things that nobody else is doing. So if you were to click on one, they have a daily news feature called Vice News Tonight. And really quick, you'll see instantly sorry, that's not the one I wanted. I wanted this one. Especially internationally, their news reporters go into places that, so here we get a quick shot of Italy. And they're really good about riding around in cars with people and really getting boots on the ground interviews. This is Isobel. Isobel's a really good reporter. And so I bring you here as just another place to get your content. And they also do on-demand content, whether it be TV shows, podcasts, print, that sort of thing. Vice is a really good place. like when Charlottesville happened and you had news agencies on either side of the spectrum filming the conflict, Vice was in the van with one of the protest organizers and getting really firsthand accounts that no one else was getting. But that's Vice. I really wanted to show y'all Vice. I think Vice does a lot of good stuff. So keeping it moving, I wanted to show you the next level marketing and why you saw the Apple button for one podcast versus another. If I can get it back here, this menu won't get out of my way. There we go. This is Acast, and what Acast does is they will work with someone like Spotify and get your podcast, your marketing out to people like you and me to trump other podcasts, so to lay on top of each other. And it's really, they're like a silent third party. And it's why when you go to a website anymore these days, you always get this cookie disclaimer at the beginning of every website now. And it's like, yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. What they're doing is they're taking your behavior, throwing it in an algorithm to AI. People like Acast come back and use it. And so when you start clicking around and looking for a podcast, it's going to know which ones to show you and throw in your face first. And so that's kind of the next level marketing behind podcast. It can be kind of confusing if you want to click around in Acast, but I did want to show you Skullduggery. I was kind of hesitant on bringing up Skullduggery. Skullduggery is a bit of a tricky podcast. It's heavy content. They're not afraid to talk about conspiracy theories and things of that nature. I first ran into Skullduggery when trying to learn more about the Epstein situation, and they had some pretty interesting interviews from journalists and people of that nature that were kind of on the ground with that story before anybody else was. Skullduggery is interesting if you're into the tales. But like anything, beware the rabbit hole you go down. And so coming back, that's a lot of it. That's podcast in a nutshell. Everybody has their own type of favorites. I have a podcast that I listen to every day. That's the Dan Le Batard Show through ESPN. Now, I call it the Seinfeld a podcast. It's a podcast about nothing. But really, the reason why I listen to it, it's a podcast wrapped in an enigma of inside jokes. It's background noise, and it just keeps a smile on my face with their shenanigans all day long. And it drives my partner, Thais, crazy because she thinks they're stupid. But it's, yeah, sometimes you just can't handle all the serious content that's out there.
What's it called again, Dan?
Oh, the Dan Le Batard Show, and it's through ESPN. And so it's a podcast. If you were to go check it out, it'd take you about 2 weeks just to even get a grasp of what's going on, because they use so many inside jokes. Because ESPN, because they're affiliated, they make fun of themselves. What their whole model is to make fun of the seriousness of sports and sports broadcasting specifically. And so Dan loves to make fun of no one more than coaches. In like coach speech, you get, so prime example, Bill Belichick. And he gets on there and he says, football, win. And Dan's really good about taking that and kind of spinning it and just kind of making fun of themselves and the whole industry. But they still he's a really respected, so before the show, Dan, he's a University of Miami alum. He came out of the Miami Herald, and he is I'm not sure if he's won the Pulitzer or not, but he is a prize-winning journalist. He has a lot of respect within the industry from other hard-hitting journalists. And so when he gets that hard-hitting journalist on the show, they're only there out of respect for Dan, and a lot of times they get frustrated because his sidekick, Stu Gatz, is a bumbling idiot. And so they parody off each other. It's almost like some of the shows that you would see back in the 40s, and where the two personalities kind of play off of each other. And so it's good for, again, mindless content. Keep a smile on your face. That's kind of why I listen to them. If I'm going for hard-hitting news, so if you want my unsolicited opinion on things that I would listen to for hard-hitting news, I'm someone who likes to hear from both sides of the spectrum. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the New York Times does lean a little bit left. So I'd hit the New York Times, and let's say the Times was hitting a topic like, let's go really recent, the recent Fox News report of China and the possibility of the coronavirus coming out of a Wuhan lab. Okay, I'm going to listen to the Daily's take on that, but I'm also going to listen to Ben Shapiro's take on that. I really like to see, one, if there's overlap between the two. Second, where they actually differentiate and really try to figure out that voice. Again, NPR is good. I don't know. A lot of it seems dated to me. Up first, out of the different charts we've looked at, it's been top 5 in most of them. And so they're probably trying to catch up with the game and doing some good stuff. Again, I've listened to I've BBC for every day for 2 years, NPR, VOA. That type of programming gets kind of left behind when you have these eccentric personalities bringing you these hard-hitting guests, really delivering some nuanced content that, frankly, you used to not get.
And can I jump in for a minute?
Yeah. Actually, let's just go ahead, open up for questions. That's podcast. It's kind of about.
Years ago, I used to use iTunes U for a lecture series from Harvard, Yale, and University of Miami and UCLA. And they were wonderful lecture series on a whole variety of topics: American history, foreign policy, current and ancient, and art, sports, a whole lot of topics that were recorded and archived. And is that available still on, because iTunes U is now gone.
Yeah, so the best way you're going to be able to look through that is through iTunes. Try searching for either said university, said professor, or said topic, and try to figure it out that way. For the more niche programming like that would be, Stitcher is going to be a good one because they cover it all. iTunes, to be honest with you, the Apple Podcast app, I just seldomly use it in terms of its power, what we refer to as power or capacity to go out and find that. It really depends on the individual creating said content, where they've decided to do their licensure through. So whether or not they've made it available to Apple. It's just like an author with a book. Have they allowed whatever platform like a Kindle to house their content? So like Apple or Stitcher or Spotify, a lot of that's all through licensure. That's why so you had that lecture that you used to listen to. That's why I know it seems really basic, but go through Google, and Google is so smart with its artificial intelligence, essentially. Google is AI. It's so smart with that. It'll direct you to where you need to go. That's what I do. When I hear about somebody, like let's say I'd never heard of Jon Favreau, and I really like, what's this Jon Favreau guy about? Like, well, why is everybody talking about Jon Favreau? Like, what's he talking about? Why is he so popular? And it's like, oh, that's not Jon Favreau. That's an actor. And it's like, well, what's going on here? Well, people talked about a podcast, so let's narrow it down that way. Oh, here's Jon Favreau. Oh, it's Pod Save. That's honestly, I know it seems really rudimentary. That's the best way to do it. If you know there's content out there that you want to find, let Google find it for you. The Apple app itself, it's only going to be so powerful through its search box. You just have to play with your keyword search in terms of a name, in terms of an institution or topic of discussion. That's how you're going to search through that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
Thank you.
So, any questions? It's scheduled to go to 11. I know I hit you with some wide-ranging things. Podcasts are not really complex. It's the same content that you've always had. It's just on demand now. And a lot of it for me, so again, just cherry picking here. So Joe Rogan's a good example of being proprietary. Joe's podcast can be kind of hard to find, like the actual podcast itself. You got to know through your Google search where to find it, because YouTube's going to pop up a lot, but that can kind of it's really limited, because YouTube really depends on someone going out there and posting it to YouTube. So Spotify, when I go look for the Joe Rogan podcast, so let me go ahead and share again with you and give you a good example of that. So when I go to my Spotify account and I go in, and this is what I mean about knowing where to go. So Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan. See, you get all this. And it's like, what's all this? I just want the Joe Rogan podcast. Why am I seeing all this stuff? So you would
everything.
I'm sorry?
My screen just says listen without limits. Is that what yours says?
No, can you see my Spotify account?
In the upper left?
Yeah, we see the ad at the top of your Spotify page. So if you scroll down, what are you looking for, Dan?
Oh, okay. I'm glad you got that. Can you see it now?
No.
I mean, we see your Spotify page. I just missed what exactly you were going to show us.
I was just trying to show proprietary podcasts and why they show up on some platforms and not others.
So I think if you can scroll down on that screen, we might see more, but all we see is the ad at the top that says listen without limits.
Okay. I think I know why.
Or
it's Zoom. It won't let me. You have to. Let's see if I can. Here we go. Got it figured out now. Sorry, guys. Y'all been sitting there and you haven't seen this at all. So real quick, this is Spotify. You can browse, radio. It does music. So genres, podcast charts, new releases. It does it all. So, but if you were to say you got a Spotify account, you want to listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, you enter Joe Rogan, you quickly see all this jumble of stuff. And I just want to listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. Why can't I find it? But Joe Rogan apparently doesn't have licensure through Spotify. And so what you get is a lot of, I call them spin-offs, secondary podcasts. This is not the Joe Rogan podcast. This is not the Joe Rogan podcast. And so you can run into that. Whereas versus, and bear with me, I have to toggle back and forth through screens here. And that's why you would go to someone like Stitcher, who's going to have all of them. I don't have a Stitcher account, so I can't show you, but you would find Joe Rogan here. Possibly on the iTunes app, if you go in there, it might be there, but it's just proprietary in nature. And so coming back. So any other questions? And so let Google do the searching for you. I know it seems basic, but it'll usually take you to the right spot. My advice, if you were to do a fee for service, I like Spotify because that's where I use my music. So the idea of you had mentioned your iTunes app and how you can download podcasts and go. You can do that with music through Spotify. So I have albums upon albums just saved to my phone. I go running, I put my phone on airplane mode to shut off its Wi-Fi and its data collection, and I can just go to my Spotify app and listen to those on-demand albums that I downloaded. And so it really, unfortunately, it replaces all those lovely CD collection and record collections you used to have. Everything's digital now. My car, again, won't play anything physical. It's all plug-in, all digital. And it's a 2015. It's not even that new of a car. It's just the way the world has gone. They've really figured out how to really manipulate MP3s and use that data. Any questions on podcast? Any problems you've had in the past that maybe I can help answer to alleviate any type of learning curve?
Not till I practice.
Yeah. I think one to really, as a beginner, that New York Times The Daily is a good one to start off with to kind of get the idea why podcast in the first place. Why is this way of consuming content so trendy now? I think that's a good one to start with. It's almost like, so where the Atheneum make it relevant, it's almost like authors. You're a fiction or a nonfiction reader, you have a genre you like. Podcasts allow you to go out there and really access your author and get ideas and content from that author almost on a daily basis, weekly basis. The more you start listening, the further down the rabbit hole you go. I used to listen to music. I used to be a music snob, listen to music, really prided myself on discovering new artists and albums. The last 5-6 years, podcasts have kind of consumed that time of day that would be allotted for that. And I would say my music consumption is down like 50%, if not more. I listen to podcasts so much. Bill Simmons is big in my life. Again, the Dan Le Batard Show, just because it's just easy listening, keeps a smile on your face. If there's something within the world that's going on and I want acclaimed journalists' feedback, industry leaders' take on it, it really, again, you can kind of cherry pick if you want it come from the New York Times. I'm sure if you're someone that likes Fox News and you're someone who likes Hannity, I'm sure Hannity has a podcast. Everybody has a podcast these days. Everybody. You can go out there and find it and devour the content, really. And so it's just for drives, for long drives, a good podcast, let's say you got a 2-hour drive, my Dan Le Batard Show alone will eat those 2 hours quick. You'll be so engrossed in thought, it really cuts the drive time in half mentally. Any other questions? Any other topics? There's podcasts for everything, self-help podcast, DIY. Go ahead, Janet.
I was just going to say, if you get the Sunday Times, the New York Times, I don't remember what sections it's in. It might be arts and leisure, but they almost every week they seem to have a whole section on topics, and then they say like 6 podcasts you could listen to. So if you're into like working out or whatever it might be, and they'll recommend like 6 or 7 podcasts, and sometimes that's like a good way to start. And then what'll happen, kind of like what Daniel said, is you listen to ones, it'll recommend similar podcasts. Or what I see a lot of people doing is like, they'll say, I've gone through all my podcasts, what are you listening to? And they'll put it on Facebook or something. And everyone's always listening to something. So lots of times I'll give a shout out. And I use, I don't know if you'll see on my phone, I use an app called Castbox because I don't have an iPhone anymore. And it's Castbox, Castbox, and I've never, like, I guess it's hard to see, but I've never not been able to find something I'm looking for. Like if I see a recommendation or whatever, I've been able to search for that podcast, and I've been able to, there was one, but it was like an extremely local, small, obscure podcast. So.
There's tons of apps like what Janet's talking about. Again, it's an expanding market. It's a booming market for content. And their whole credibility slash if they're going to live within that market, if they're going to survive as a company, they have to have access to all the on-demand content you could think of. So if Janet's app, for hypothetical sake, if it didn't have those apps or podcasts that she was looking for, it wouldn't survive. So that's where the different apps compete with each other, is who has the most comprehensive database, essentially, for podcasts out there. And they're fighting for it. And that's where that company Acast comes involved. They're the middleman. They're like the PR agent between content producer and platform for said content. They're going to spin it everywhere. It gets really interesting if you're someone that gets into that type of marketing. It gets kind of crazy, really.
And
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there's literally podcasts for everything. Like there's a podcast I heard called Percast, and they just talk about cats. And then they have there's there's new age ones. There's one having to do with religion. There's self-help. There's stuff on, like if you're an engineer, you look at engineer, like there's whatever niche you're into, you're going to find a podcast about it.
But what's the first thing you go to when you're in your search bar, when you're trying to look at that high level of not granularity? I mean, I'm not looking for the name of Spotify or something. What would I go to just to get started on that kind of search?
Like just what you might like to listen to?
No, how do I just even get to it?
Oh, get to it. So would you like to listen on your laptop, like on a computer or on your phone?
Well, let's say computer for the moment.
Okay. Yeah. Like Daniel said, if you Google Stitcher, you go to Stitch, I think it's Stitcher.com, right? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
So you have to know the name of one of the services that you want to go to.
Yeah. Honestly, the reason why I use Chartable, and I actually didn't discover Chartable until like this last week, but that's because I have the benefit of knowing how to navigate the industry. Chartable does a good job of laying out the main three providers, right? Apple, Stitcher, Spotify. But then it also allows you to see podcasts not only rated through the charts, but you can actually click on them and start listening then. So Chartable is a good beginner place.
Okay, good.
Right? Chartable is going to not only introduce you to really popular podcasts, but also show you the alternatives to the platforms to listen. If you're just starting off, you're not ready for something like Stitcher or Spotify, to be honest, because they're going to want you're going to hit a paywall real quick. What I mean by paywall is they want you to make an account and start paying monthly. And, if you're just starting off, I wouldn't go that route yet. Not until you really start getting a podcast that you want to devour daily or weekly and personalities that you really like, just like the way we used to watch TV.
Got it.
The joke making the rounds now amongst my circle of friends is, I finished with Netflix, what's next?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And, it's the same model, the same idea. There's Netflix, HBO is all on-demand streaming now. And, Amazon Prime, there's so much TV. They really are the same concept. It's on-demand TV versus on-demand radio, which is podcast. And so there's so much content, it's head spinning. But it just starts with clicking away, and, you're going to run into stuff you don't like, and you just move on, and they usually lead you to the stuff you like.
Thanks, Daniel.
Of course. Any other questions?
I have a quick one.
Mm-hmm.
I found a couple of podcast that the Egan Institute did. It's called Time and Tide. And I would like to download those so I could listen to them later. I have an iPhone.
Mhm.
So how do I do that?
So again, it's going to depend on the app in which you access said podcast. And so if it's through that iTunes app, there should be a download feature. Now, not every podcast it's all licensure. Not every podcast you're going to be able to download. Just like on Netflix, you can't download every TV show. They'll pick and choose what you can or can't download.
This one
Now-
actually has the option.
Okay.
You can listen on Apple Podcasts or you can listen on Spotify.
Okay. If you have Spotify, you can download on Spotify. And there's on your phone's app, you'll have that bottom menu. You go to your library and you search through your library. And when you bring up that podcast, it'll have a little download icon just above the title of the specific episode.
Mhm.
And you'll just click on that icon and it'll download. It's not unlike Netflix. If you were downloading Netflix before you went on a plane.
Okay, I don't have Netflix.
Okay.
So,
When
okay,
we
I
get
just didn't
together again, I'll troubleshoot you, Pam. But it really is. If you've got a better suggestion, Janet, it really is. You go into Spotify. First of all, just search it. Bring up that episode that you want to play that you're looking for. And there
Mhm.
should be an icon that you can tap on and just download. It'll look like a little cloud. It might be like an up arrow pointing at a cloud. Each proprietary service has their own icon to download, but you can you might even be able to heart it, but hearting doesn't necessarily connote downloading. That's your way of, so here's another thing that they do. When you heart something on these platforms, that's how they manipulate their algorithms to show you things that you like. So it creates a trend in your consumption. So if I keep hearting bands that were within the same genre, you're going to get a heavy payload of that genre coming at you. Same thing with podcast.
Gotcha.
There's
Because I was able to do Spotify on my computer, and that was free. But when I tried to do it on my phone, it kept wanting me to pay for it on my app. I'm like, no. So that was an issue. So I don't have Spotify on my phone, but I do have Apple Podcast on my phone because it's an iPhone.
And when you opened the Apple Podcast app on your phone, did you search for that podcast in your Apple app, or you just know it exists?
I haven't done anything yet. I found it on the Egan Institute website, and it's the Skipper Chase and then the Wreck of the Hazard. They're the two podcasts. Yeah. And I'm afraid to go next step because I don't want it to get lost.
Yeah. No, that's
somewhere.
Okay. So you, so two things. You might be able to, you can search, use a browser on your phone. So you might be able to just click play on the website and listen to it there.
Yep.
So you could do it that way, and you'd have it on your phone, so you could go for a walk or do, if you're in the kitchen or whatever. Or the other thing you do is if you go open the Apple Podcast app, there should be a place to search. Remember there were a couple podcasts I'd recommended. If you search for it, it might pop up there. It might not. It might be too obscure, and it might, like Daniel's. It's almost like someone comes in the library and do you have this really obscure book from 1942? And you're like, no, we don't have that.
Right.
So, although we might, Pam would know. But so it's the same thing with the app. It might not pop up.
Yeah, honestly, Pam, I'm about 80% sure you won't find that on the iTunes app. It's going to be provided on their website, and that's just where that data is stored. I just did a quick search through the iTunes app, that Apple Podcast app, and it's no way. It doesn't exist.
I just was trying to load it, you said, so I could go for a walk and listen to it later.
Yeah. Unfortunately, those really niche, regional, smaller personalities, they're going to be hard to do that on-demand download and go type function. It's just now if you can now Stitcher or someone who really prides themselves on being podcast everything, they might be able to go out and grab it and find it. You'll have to do multiple searches on multiple platforms to figure out how to do that. Honestly, the quickest way is to contact Egan and figure out if they have their podcast anywhere besides their website.
Okay, I'll see if I can figure out how to get it from
Daniel,
here to Apple. I'll just.
I have an Apple. I'm going to share my screen for a second because I think you can do it, Pam.
Okay. And that's if I have my Apple password somewhere nearby.
No, that's okay. No. You don't need your podcast. You don't need your password or anything, I don't think. So what I did is I went to, so here, I went to the Egan Maritime, here, I'll start from the very beginning. I went to their website and up top, they have all these things. So I went to podcasts and then we're excited to launch Time and Tide. So I clicked on that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so here you have the 2 episodes. And right here it says listen on Apple Podcasts. So if you click on this, you can click on this and it'll send it to the app, like it'll subscribe it. And then you'll be able to open the Apple Podcast app and listen to it there. Or like I said, it has this play feature. So you could just play from the website and go for your walk, and it's not playing through the app, but it's still playing.
Hey, Janet.
Yes.
The icon far right, is that a download icon?
This
or
one.
Is that a send?
It's a share.
That's what I thought.
But I think, here, I'll just do it. I don't usually use this because I have a Droid phone, but yeah. So it'll pull up here, and so right here, it'll look a little different on your phone or your computer, but I would click on subscribe, because what that means is, as Egan Maritime, assuming they do more of these, every time they do another one, it'll pop up in your feed. Like it'll pop up so you don't miss any.
Okay.
Yeah, and whether or not you can download it, Janet, I know that the app itself does have a library, and that's just the term they use to where you store your downloaded content. You just have to play with it and figure out whether or not you can or not.
Yeah, and the more you use it, the more you get familiar with, just like anything else. Like you kind of are listening one day, you're like, what does this button do? And you're like, oh, that's what it does. So yeah, just kind of dive in.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. This was very helpful.
Good.
Good job, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate it, guys.
All right.
Keep checking out the Atheneum website for all the upcoming stuff, and hang in there.
Thank you.
Hang in there.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.